There are journeys in your life that are measured not in miles, but in the distance you travel from the person you used to be. My journey began on a Tuesday in October, with the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel and the mournful cry of a train horn cutting through the damp city air. I was running away, though I preferred the more dignified term relocating. I had packed my life into 2 suitcases and a camera bag, leaving behind an apartment that had become a mausoleum of memory, a city that had promised me everything and given me a masterclass in disappointment. The train was an escape vessel, a silver bullet aimed at a future I could not yet see, and every rotation of its wheels was a deliberate, conscious severing of a tie to my past. I had booked a seat in the quiet car, a small, selfish prayer for anonymity, for a few days of uninterrupted solitude where I could just watch the world blur past my window and feel nothing at all. He arrived about 20 minutes after we'd pulled out of the station, a flurry of apologies and polite chaos. He was late, flustered, wrestling a laptop bag that seemed determined to defy him. He had the seat next to me. Of course he did. In a half-empty carriage, fate, or perhaps just the train line's cruel ticketing algorithm, had decided to place him right there, in the fragile bubble of solitude I had so carefully constructed. I remember the scent of rain on his coat, a clean, earthy smell that cut through the sterile, recycled air of the train. He stowed his bag overhead, mumbling another apology as his elbow brushed my shoulder, a spark of warmth that felt like an intrusion. I gave him a tight, barely there smile that I hoped conveyed acknowledged, but please do not engage, and turned back to my window, focusing on the grayscale warehouses and skeletal trees of the city's industrial outskirts. I was an observer, a photographer. My entire life was built around framing the world from a safe distance, and this man was now inside my frame, too close, too present. I didn't want to notice him, but he was impossible to ignore. He was a study in controlled energy, a man who seemed to vibrate at a slightly higher frequency than the rest of the world. He settled in, pulled out a book, but his focus was a pretense. His knee bounced with a nervous rhythm, a silent drumbeat against the floor. His gaze kept drifting from his page to the window, not seeing the landscape, but lost somewhere inside his own head. I could feel the low hum of his restlessness beside me, an anxious current in the quiet air. I told myself it was professional curiosity, the photographer's instinct to catalog the human condition. I noted the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way he ran a hand through his dark, unruly hair when he thought no one was looking, a gesture of profound weariness that contradicted the sharp, tailored lines of his shirt. He was a contradiction, a puzzle I had no desire to solve, yet my mind began to work on him anyway, fitting the pieces together without my permission. He was a story, and despite my best efforts to close the book, the first page had already been turned. Before I could fully retreat back into the fortress of my own thoughts, he turned to me. The movement was sudden enough to make me flinch. "Sorry," he said, his voice softer than I expected, a low tenor that seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the train rather than compete with it. "I'm a terrible seatmate. All this fidgeting. I'm making the whole car vibrate, aren't I?" A small, self-deprecating smile touched his lips, and it was a disarming thing. It wasn't a charming, practiced smile. It was tired and genuine, and it made the exhaustion around his eyes seem less like a flaw and more like a part of his history. I found myself offering a real, if small, smile in return. "It's fine," I said, my own voice raspy from disuse. "The train is doing most of the vibrating," he chuckled, a quiet, breathy sound. "Right? Good. Julian, by the way," he offered a hand, and the gesture felt so strangely formal and old-fashioned in the cramped, modern space of the train car. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my mind cataloging the risks of this simple connection. A handshake was an agreement, a tiny contract of acknowledgement. But leaving his hand hanging there felt like a deliberate act of cruelty, and I was tired of being cruel, especially to myself. I took his hand. His grip was firm, his palm warm and dry. It was over in a moment, but the warmth lingered on my skin, a physical imprint. "Leo," I replied, pulling my hand back and immediately tucking it into my pocket, as if to preserve the sensation. Leo, he repeated, testing the name. Well, Leo, I promised to try and keep my existential dread to a low hum for the remainder of our journey. He gave me that smile again, and then, as if a switch had been flipped, he turned back to his book. The conversation was over. The boundary was reestablished. But something had changed. The space between us was no longer just an empty gap. It was charged with a new awareness. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was Julian. And I, against my better judgment, was Leo. The anonymity I had craved was already beginning to dissolve, like salt in water, and the journey had barely even begun. I stared out the window, but I was no longer seeing the passing scenery. I was seeing the ghost of his handshake, feeling the echo of his warmth, and a quiet, unfamiliar panic began to bloom in my chest. This was not part of the plan. To understand the depth of that panic, you have to understand the city I was leaving behind. It was a place built on a foundation of granite and ambition, a vertical metropolis that taught you to measure your worth by how high you could climb. I had arrived there 5 years earlier, a recent art school graduate with a portfolio full of black and white landscapes and a heart full of misguided optimism. I believed in the myth of the city, the idea that it was a crucible where talent was forged and dreams were realized. I saw beauty in its brutalist architecture, in the stark geometry of its shadows, in the faces of the millions of people who rushed through its streets like blood cells in a vast, uncaring artery. I wanted to capture its soul, to translate its chaotic energy into still, silent frames. My camera was my shield and my key. It allowed me to be present but separate, to get close to people without ever having to truly connect. I worked as a freelance photographer, taking any job that came my way. Corporate headshots that felt like soul theft, sterile product photography, the occasional wedding where I'd focus on the architectural details of the church to avoid the cloying, performative emotion of it all. In my own time, I wandered the streets, hunting for those fleeting moments of grace and truth. A splash of color from a graffiti tag on a grimy wall. An old man feeding pigeons in a sliver of sunlight between two skyscrapers. A child's reflection in a puddle, a perfect, fleeting mirror of the sky. These were the images that kept me going, the small affirmations that there was still something beautiful to be found in the overwhelming noise. My apartment was a tiny shoebox on the 4th floor of a walk-up, with a window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was my sanctuary and my cell. The walls were covered in my own photographs, a gallery of my slow disillusionment. The early pictures were hopeful, full of wide-open spaces and dramatic light. The more recent ones were tighter, more claustrophobic. Close-ups of cracked pavement, rusted fire escapes, the strained faces of people on the subway. The city had begun to close in on me, its relentless energy no longer inspiring but draining. It felt like standing at the bottom of the ocean, the weight of all that water pressing down, making it impossible to breathe. The ambition that had once driven me had curdled into a quiet, gnawing anxiety. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, documenting moments without ever truly living them. And then there was Mark. Mark was part of the city, part of the dream that had soured. We met at a gallery opening, one of those sterile white rooms where people talk loudly about art to prove they understand it. He was a curator, sharp and witty, with a way of looking at me that made me feel seen, not just observed. For a while, it was good. He understood my work, or at least he said he did. He called my photographs hauntingly honest and encouraged my street photography. But our love was like the city itself, exciting and beautiful from a distance, but up close, it was all sharp edges and hidden decay. He loved the idea of me, the brooding artist, more than he loved the actual, living person. He wanted me to be a character in the story of his life, a fascinating, slightly damaged accessory. Our relationship was a series of beautifully framed moments that lacked any real substance. Dinners at trendy restaurants where the food was more conceptual than nourishing. Weekends in sterile, minimalist hotels. Conversations that felt like interviews. I was an object in his curated collection. The end came not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating realization. We were at another gallery, standing in front of a massive, abstract painting. He was explaining its meaning, its place in the canon of contemporary art, and I looked at his face, so animated and passionate, and I realized he had never once looked at me with that same intensity. He had never tried to understand the composition of my own soul. He analyzed my photographs, but he never asked about the loneliness that produced them. It's about the tension between form and chaos, he was saying, gesturing at the canvas. And all I could think was, that's us. I was the chaos he was trying to fit into a neat, acceptable form. The breakup was civilized, of course. Everything with Mark was civilized. It was a calm, rational discussion over artisanal coffee. He said we wanted different things. He was right. He wanted a beautiful picture. I wanted a home. After he left, the apartment became unbearable. Every object held a memory. Every shadow seemed to mock me. The city itself felt like his territory. Every street corner, every cafe, every museum was a potential site of ambush, a place where I might run into him and have to perform that same polite, civilized detachment. The camera felt heavy in my hands. The act of framing the world felt pointless when my own life was so completely out of focus. The decision to leave was not a single, dramatic choice, but a slow, creeping tide of necessity. It started as a fantasy, a daydream on the subway. What if I just left? What if I sold everything that wouldn't fit in a suitcase and just went? I imagined a smaller place, a town with trees and a horizon that wasn't serrated by skyscrapers. A place where the silence was real, not just the absence of sirens. The fantasy grew more detailed, more insistent. I started looking at maps, at train routes. The idea of a train appealed to me. It was slower than a plane, more deliberate. It was a journey, not just a teleportation. It offered a period of transition, a buffer zone between the old life and the new. I chose a small city on the coast, a place I had visited once as a child. My memory of it was hazy, impressionistic. The smell of salt and pine, the cry of gulls, the vast, unbroken expanse of the ocean. It seemed like the antithesis of the city I was in. It was horizontal, not vertical. It was defined by nature, not by concrete. I found a tiny apartment online, a converted attic with slanted ceilings and a view of the water. I paid the deposit without ever seeing it in person. It was a reckless act of faith, a desperate bet on an unknown future. The act of booking the train ticket was the final, definitive step. It felt like signing a treaty with myself. I would go. I would leave the ghost of my former self behind. I would try to learn how to breathe again. That was the man who boarded the train that Tuesday. A man running from ghosts, carrying the weight of a failed city, a failed love, and a failed dream. A man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. And that was the man Julian, with his rain-scented coat and his restless energy, had sat down next to. The afternoon bled into evening. The gray, industrial landscape softened into rolling hills and farmland, painted in the muted tones of late autumn. A low, golden light, the kind I lived to capture, spilled across the carriage, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Julian had fallen asleep. His book had slipped from his grasp, lying open on his lap. His head had slumped forward at first, but with the gentle rocking of the train, it had slowly, inevitably, listed to the side until it came to rest on my shoulder. My first instinct was to tense up, to shift away, to wake him. It was an invasion of my space, a violation of the unspoken contract between strangers on public transport. My entire body went rigid. But he was so deeply asleep. A profound, almost boneless exhaustion had taken him. His breathing was slow and even, a soft puff of warm air against my neck with every exhale. He mumbled something in his sleep, a single, incoherent word, and settled more heavily against me. And in that moment, my defensiveness faltered. To wake him would feel like a cruelty. He was not an intruder. He was just a tired man. So I stayed perfectly still. I became a statue, a piece of architecture for him to lean on. It was the most bizarre and intimate physical contact I had experienced in months. More intimate than any of the last, hollow embraces I had shared with Mark. This was an act of unconscious, unthinking trust. He didn't know me, yet in his sleep, He had sought me out for comfort, for stability. My shoulder, which had ached under the weight of my camera bag for years, now felt like it was serving a purpose. I studied his face in the fading light. The tense lines of weariness had smoothed out. His eyelashes were dark against his skin. A stray lock of hair had fallen across his forehead. He looked younger, more vulnerable. The confident, fidgety man was gone, replaced by someone much quieter. My photographer's brain kicked in, despite myself. I saw the image, the warm, directional light from the window, the soft texture of his sweater, the contrast between his dark hair and the pale fabric of my own shirt. The way his hand was curled loosely on his lap, a study in relaxation. It was a perfect composition. It was a moment of profound peace, of unguarded humanity. It was the kind of picture I had been trying and failing to take for years. I had an almost overwhelming urge to reach for my camera, to preserve this fragile moment. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. Any motion would shatter the stillness, would wake him and break the spell. And more than that, it felt like a betrayal. This moment wasn't for my portfolio. It wasn't an object to be captured and cataloged. It was something to be lived. So I just sat there, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs, and let him sleep. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't an observer. I was a part of the scene. I was the anchor, and it felt strangely, terrifyingly, like coming home. He slept for over an hour. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world outside the window dissolved into a deep, velvety blue. The lights inside the carriage came on, casting a soft, artificial glow. I watched the reflection in the glass, the two of us, a single, still shape against the fleeting landscape. It looked like a painting of travelers, of companions. When he finally stirred, it was with a slow, groggy disorientation. He shifted, and the movement was like a geological event, a slow tectonic plate sliding into a new position. He lifted his head from my shoulder, blinking in the sudden light. It took him a moment to process where he was, and more importantly, where he had been. The realization dawned on his face in slow, painful stages. First, confusion. Then, dawning awareness. And finally, a wave of crimson horror that spread from his neck all the way to the tips of his ears. He scrambled upright, pulling away from me as if I were on fire. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice hoarse with sleep and mortification. "I am so sorry. I can't believe I did that." He ran a hand over his face, scrubbing at the sleep and the embarrassment. "I haven't slept in like 2 days. Project deadline." "You know," he was rambling, over-explaining, trying to fill the suddenly vast and awkward space between us with words. I could have made it easy for him. I could have said, "Don't worry about it," and turned back to the window, granting him the mercy of a swift retreat. But something held me back. Perhaps it was the memory of his vulnerability in sleep, or perhaps it was a flicker of my own loneliness, reaching out for a connection. "It's okay," I said, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "You look like you needed it." My response seemed to stop him short. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since he'd sat down. His eyes were a warm, hazel color, and they were wide with a mixture of gratitude and surprise. The frantic energy had subsided, replaced by a quiet stillness. "Yeah," he said, his voice dropping back to that soft, low register. "I guess I did." "Thank you," he paused, then added, "for not shoving me onto the floor." A real laugh escaped me then, not just a polite chuckle. The thought crossed my mind. I lied, but it seemed like a lot of paperwork. He laughed too, a genuine, relieved sound that filled the space between us, clearing the air. The awkwardness dissipated, replaced by something new. A fragile, tentative camaraderie. The wall I had so carefully constructed around myself had a crack in it now. A small one, but it was there. And through it, a little bit of light was getting in. It was in that moment, in the aftermath of his embarrassment and my unexpected grace, that our journey together truly began. The train was still hurtling through the darkness, but for the first time, I wasn't just running away from something. I felt like I might be heading towards something instead. The train had a dining car, a relic from a more civilized era of travel. An announcement crackled over the intercom. announcing the first dinner service. The thought of navigating a meal in a room full of strangers made my stomach clench with the familiar knot of social anxiety. My plan had been to subsist on the protein bars I had packed, to remain in my seat, in my bubble, for the entire 3-day journey. But then Julian turned to me, a hopeful, almost boyish look on his face. "Are you going to get dinner?" he asked. "I'm starving. I think my body is finally realizing it's been running on coffee and panic for a week." The question hung in the air, an unspoken invitation. He could have just gone by himself. But he asked. He was including me. It was a simple, polite question, but it felt like a test. A choice. I could retreat into my shell, mumble something about not being hungry, and reinforce the boundary between us. Or I could take a small step out of my comfort zone, out of the carefully constructed fortress of my solitude. The Leo of yesterday would have chosen the protein bar without hesitation. But the Leo of today, the Leo who had served as a pillow for a stranger and felt a flicker of connection, hesitated. "I hadn't thought about it," I said, which was a lie. I had thought about it and decided against it. "Well, think about it now," he said, his smile gentle. "I'd feel better about the whole drooling on your shoulder incident if you let me buy you a meal as an apology." He was giving me an out. Framing it as a transaction, a repayment of a debt, made it easier to accept. It was a kindness. I looked at his tired, hopeful face, and I thought about the cold, tasteless protein bar waiting in my bag. I thought about another long, silent evening spent staring at my own reflection in the dark window. "Okay," I heard myself say. The word felt foreign in my mouth. "Okay, dinner sounds good." The relief that washed over his face was immediate and profound. It was as if I had given him a gift. And maybe I had. Maybe he was just as lonely as I was. We walked the swaying corridors between the cars, a clumsy, stumbling ballet. The dining car was warm and brightly lit, full of the murmur of conversation and the clinking of cutlery. It felt like a different world from the hushed quiet of our carriage. We were seated at a small table for two, the window beside us a black, reflective void showing only our own faces and the warm interior of the car. The white tablecloth felt impossibly formal, the single plastic rose in a little vase a touch of absurd aspiration. And we talked. At first, it was the easy, superficial talk of strangers. "What do you do? Where are you going?" He was a software engineer, as I'd guessed, on his way to a new job in the same coastal city I had chosen. The coincidence was so startling that it made me laugh. He said he was tired of the tech bro culture of his old city, the constant pressure to innovate and disrupt and hustle. He wanted to work for a smaller company, to have a life outside of code. He spoke about programming with a strange mixture of passion and fatigue. He described it as building worlds out of pure logic, creating elegant, invisible structures. It was a creative process, he insisted, just like my photography. I found myself telling him about my work, about the city I had left. I was hesitant at first, giving him the curated, professional version. But he listened with such genuine, focused interest, asking questions that were insightful and perceptive. He didn't just ask what I photographed, he asked why. He asked how it felt to see the world in frames. No one had ever asked me that before, not even Mark. I told him about my frustration, my creative block, the feeling of being a ghost in my own life. The words came out more easily than I expected, as if the motion of the train were shaking them loose. "It sounds like you were drowning," he said softly, after I'd finished a long, rambling monologue about the oppressive weight of the city. He didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. He just stated a simple, empathetic truth. He saw it. He understood. I admitted, the confession a quiet exhale. "I think I forgot how to swim. Maybe you just needed a different ocean," he replied, and his gaze was so direct, so full of a quiet understanding, that I had to look away, focusing on the way the train's vibration made the water in my glass tremble. In the reflection, I saw us. Two strangers, sharing a meal, sharing truths they hadn't spoken aloud to anyone else. The space between us was no longer empty. It was filled with the fragile architecture of a new connection, a structure built of shared confessions and unexpected empathy. The train rattled on through the night, carrying us towards an unknown destination. But for the first time, the journey itself felt like the point. That dinner established a new pattern, a ritual for our journey. The train became our own small, self-contained world, with its own rhythms and routines. The quiet car was our home base, our shared living room. The dining car was for our long, rambling conversations. The observation car, with its domed glass ceiling, was our place for silent contemplation. We would sit there for hours, side by side, watching the country unfold around us. The flat plains of the Midwest gave way to the rugged, dramatic landscapes of the West. Mountains rose up like jagged teeth against the sky, their peaks dusted with the first snows of the season. Rivers carved silver paths through deep canyons. We didn't always talk. In fact, much of our time together was spent in a comfortable, companionable silence. He would read, and I would watch the world through my photographer's eye, composing shots in my head. A lone hawk circling in a vast blue sky. The geometric patterns of irrigated fields. The way the late afternoon sun set a stand of aspen trees on fire with golden light. I never took out my camera. I was afraid that the click of the shutter would break the spell, that it would turn these shared moments into something to be possessed rather than experienced. I wanted to live them, not just document them. The physical space between us continued to shrink. It happened in small, almost imperceptible increments. A shared armrest that our arms would eventually rest against, side by side. Our shoulders brushing as we navigated the narrow aisle. The way our knees would sometimes knock together when the train lurched, a brief point of contact that neither of us would rush to break. These were tiny, insignificant touches, the kind that happened between any two people sharing a small space for a long time. But in the hyper-aware state of my mind, they were monumental events. Each one was a small spark that sent a jolt of warmth through my system. I would analyze them endlessly, replaying them in my mind. Was it accidental? Was it intentional? Did he feel it too? He had a way of leaning in when he spoke, a natural, unconscious inclination to close the distance. He would show me a passage in his book, his head close to mine, and I would be acutely aware of the smell of his shampoo, a faint, clean scent of sandalwood. He would point out something in the landscape, his arm crossing in front of me, his hand hovering near the glass, and for a moment, I would be enclosed, surrounded by his presence. My body learned the geography of his. I knew the exact space he occupied, the subtle shifts in his weight, the rhythm of his breathing. It was an intimacy born of proximity, an intimacy that existed in a strange, ambiguous gray area. We were not friends, not yet. We were not lovers. We were just two people on a train. But it felt like more. One evening, we were in the observation car as the sun went down. It was a spectacular sunset, the kind that makes you feel small and insignificant in the best possible way. The sky was a riot of orange, pink, and deep purple. The clouds were edged in gold. We sat in silence, watching the colors deepen and fade. The car was almost empty, just us and a few other quiet souls. Julian was sitting next to me, his long legs stretched out. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, plunging the landscape into twilight, he let out a soft sigh. It was a sound of pure contentment. Then, he did something that made my heart stop. He rested his head against my shoulder. It was not like the first time, when he had been asleep and unaware. This was a conscious, deliberate choice. It was a quiet, simple gesture, but it was laden with meaning. It was an acknowledgement of the comfort that had grown between us. It was a statement. This is a safe place. You are a safe person. My entire body went still, just as it had the first time. But this time, it wasn't from shock or anxiety. It was from a profound, overwhelming tenderness. The weight of his head on my shoulder was both a burden and a gift. It was the weight of his trust. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just breathed, in and out, trying to match his calm, steady rhythm. I could feel the warmth of his cheek through the fabric of my shirt. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the hum of the wheels on the track. In that moment, surrounded by the vast, darkening landscape, with the weight of his head on my shoulder, I felt a sense of peace that was so deep and so complete it almost frightened me. The ghosts of my old life, the noise of the city, the ache of my loneliness, they all receded, pushed back by this simple, profound act of closeness. I looked at our reflection in the curved glass of the window, two dark silhouettes against a sky of dying embers. We looked like we belonged together, and for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder what it would be like if we did. The last day on the train felt like the end of a dream. We were due to arrive at our destination in the late afternoon. The knowledge sat between us, a silent, unspoken thing. The bubble we had been living in for 3 days was about to burst. The real world, with its complications and its demands, was waiting for us. The easy intimacy of the train, born of isolation and shared space, would not necessarily survive the transition. A strange melancholy settled over me. I found myself trying to memorize everything about the experience. The specific shade of blue of the mountains in the morning light, the taste of the slightly too strong coffee from the dining car, the sound of Julian's laugh, the feeling of his head resting on my shoulder. We spent most of the morning in the quiet car, reading, the silence between us heavier than it had been before. It was no longer entirely comfortable. It was fraught with unspoken questions. What happens when we get off this train? Do we just say goodbye and walk away? Does this whole fragile, beautiful thing we've built just dissolve into a memory? The thought was unbearable. This connection, this unexpected solace, had become a lifeline. The idea of losing it felt like returning to that state of drowning he had so accurately described. I was lost in these anxious thoughts when he spoke, his voice startling me out of my reverie. "I don't want this to end," he said. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at his book, but his eyes weren't moving. He wasn't reading. His knuckles were white where he gripped the cover. It was a confession, stark and vulnerable. He had voiced the very fear that was screaming in my own mind. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it, the moment of truth. My response would determine everything. I could retreat, make a joke, deflect, or I could be brave. I took a breath. Me neither. The words were quiet, barely a whisper, but they felt like a shout in the silent car. He finally turned to look at me, and the raw, undisguised hope in his eyes was so intense it almost hurt to see. The mask of the confident, easygoing man was completely gone. In its place was someone uncertain and afraid, and so incredibly open. "When we get there," he started, his voice a little unsteady, "I don't have a place to stay yet. I was just going to get a hotel for a week or two while I look for an apartment." He paused, gathering his courage. "My new job doesn't start for another 10 days. He was laying the facts out, building a bridge of logic and practicality for us to cross. But the real question was underneath. He wasn't talking about logistics. He was talking about us. He was asking for more time. "I have a place," I said, my own voice tight with emotion. "It's probably tiny and empty. I haven't even seen it. But it has a roof." The words were tumbling out of me now, clumsy and unplanned. "I don't know what the couch situation is like. It might be terrible, or non-existent." He wasn't smiling, but the tension in his face had eased. He just watched me, waiting. "You could stay with me," I said, the words finally landing, clear and unambiguous. "If you want. Until you find your own place." It was a reckless, insane offer. I was inviting a man I had known for 3 days to live with me. A man who, until 72 hours ago, had been a complete stranger. It went against every self-protective instinct I had honed over the years. But it felt like the most honest, most necessary thing I had ever done. It felt like stepping off a cliff, trusting that something, or someone, would be there to catch me. Julian didn't answer right away. He just held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw a universe of emotions: relief, fear, gratitude, and something else, something deeper and more tender that I couldn't yet name. The train began to slow, the landscape outside solidifying from a blur into distinct shapes. We were approaching the station, the end of the line. He reached out, not for my hand, but for my arm. His fingers wrapped around my forearm, his touch firm and grounding. It wasn't a casual touch. It was an anchor. "Okay," he said, his voice thick. "Yeah. Okay, Leo. I'd like that." The train glided into the station with a final, gentle hiss of its brakes. The journey was over. But as I looked at Julian, his hand still on my arm, his eyes full of a promise I was just beginning to understand, I knew that my real journey, the one that truly mattered, was just about to begin. We had crossed the line. There was no going back to being strangers. The only way was forward, together. The transition from the hermetically sealed world of the train to the chaos of the station was a physical shock. The air was cold and smelled of diesel fumes and damp concrete. The noise was a cacophony of announcements, rolling suitcases, and shouting voices. It was the real world, loud and indifferent, and it felt like a violation after the quiet intimacy we had shared. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of anxiety. Had we made a mistake? Was the connection we'd forged just an illusion, a trick of proximity and shared isolation, a train ship that couldn't survive on solid ground? Julian seemed to feel it too. The easy confidence he had projected, even in his weariness, had vanished. He seemed smaller, more uncertain, as we stood on the crowded platform with our bags at our feet. He kept glancing around, his brow furrowed, as if he were looking for an escape route. The man who had so bravely confessed he didn't want our time to end now looked like he wanted to disappear into the crowd. He was no longer leaning into my space. He had erected a small, invisible wall around himself. "So," he said, his voice strained and unnaturally loud to be heard over the noise. "Taxi." The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a stilted, awkward formality. My heart sank. I had been so sure, so certain, in those final moments on the train. Now, doubt came rushing in like a cold tide. I had misinterpreted everything. I had projected my own loneliness, my own desperate need for connection, onto him. I had offered him my home, and now he was regretting it. The shame was a hot flush on my cheeks. "Yeah, a taxi sounds good," I managed to say, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. The taxi ride to my new apartment was excruciatingly silent. We sat on opposite sides of the back seat, a chasm of vinyl and awkwardness between us. I stared out the window at the unfamiliar streets of this new city. It was pretty, just as I remembered. The architecture was a mix of old Victorian houses and modest, modern buildings. The ocean was a constant presence, a sliver of gray-blue at the end of every street. It was supposed to be a new beginning, a blank canvas. But all I could feel was the crushing weight of a fresh disappointment. Julian stared out his own window, his reflection a ghostly, distant figure in the glass. The vibrant, open man from the train was gone, replaced by this tense, silent stranger. My apartment was on the top floor of a creaky but charming old house. The landlady, a woman with kind eyes and a cloud of white hair, had left the key under the mat for me. The apartment itself was exactly as I'd pictured it. A single, large room under the eaves, with slanted ceilings and a wide dormer window that looked directly out at the churning, gray ocean. The walls were painted a fresh, clean white. It was completely, utterly empty. There was no furniture, not even a chair. Just our 2 suitcases and my camera bag sitting in the middle of the pale wooden floor, looking small and lost. The emptiness of the room seemed to amplify the emptiness between us. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a gull and the rhythmic sigh of the waves. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it was suffocating. "Well, this is it," I said, trying to inject a note of cheerfulness into my voice and failing miserably. "Home sweet home. It's a blank slate. It's great," Julian said, his voice flat. He walked over to the window and stared out at the water, his back to me. "The view is incredible." He stood there for a long time, his shoulders tense. He was building a wall with his silence, brick by brick. And I was letting him. The old Leo, the one who retreated at the first sign of rejection, was back in control. I felt the familiar urge to make myself smaller, to disappear, to tell him it was okay if he wanted to leave, that I understood, that it was a crazy idea anyway. But then, a different feeling rose up, something stronger than the fear. It was anger, a quiet, simmering anger. I had not torn my life apart, crossed the entire country, and taken a massive, terrifying leap of faith just to fall back into my old patterns at the first sign of trouble. I had not met this man who had, for 3 days, made me feel more seen and more alive than I had in years, just to let him retreat into a fortress of fear without a fight. The connection on that train had been real. I knew it had. It wasn't a hallucination, and I was not going to let him pretend it hadn't happened. I crossed the empty room, the sound of my footsteps loud on the wooden floor. I stopped a few feet behind him. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. This was it. Another choice. Retreat or confront. "Julian," I said. My voice was quiet, but it was firm. It held no room for retreat. He didn't turn around. "Yeah. Look at me." He hesitated for a long moment. I could see the conflict in the rigid line of his back. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was a mask of misery and confusion. The exhaustion was back, deeper than before. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at a spot on the floor somewhere between us. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice soft, but insistent. "What happened between the train platform and here?" "On the train, Yui. And now this." "You can't even look at me," he winced, the words hitting him like small, sharp stones. He finally lifted his head, and his eyes were full of a desperate, cornered panic. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "It's just, this is real. The train wasn't real. It was a bubble. It was easy. But this, an empty apartment, a new city. It's real life." And I freaked out. Freaked out about what? I pressed, taking another step closer. I wasn't going to let him off the hook with vague explanations. "About staying here? Because if you want to go get a hotel, you should just say that." "It's fine." "No." The word was explosive, torn from him. "It's not about that. It's not about the apartment." He dragged a hand through his hair, that familiar gesture of distress. "It's you. It's me. It's this." He gestured vaguely at the space between us. On the train, it made sense. It was just happening. But now, out here, I have to put a name to it, and I don't know what the name is. And it scares the hell out of me. His confession hung in the air, raw and honest. He was scared. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of the very thing I was terrified of, the beautiful, fragile, unnameable thing that had grown between us. The anger inside me dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't building a wall to keep me out. He was trapped behind a wall of his own fear. "I've never," he started, then stopped, his throat working. "I've never felt like that with anyone. So fast. So easy. And with a guy. I mean, I've thought about it, but I've never acted on it. I don't know what I'm doing, Leo. I felt like I was moving towards something on that train, something good. But the second my feet hit that platform, all I could think was, what have you done? You're going to ruin this. You're going to ruin him." His vulnerability was a gaping wound. He had torn himself open, showing me the frightened, confused man behind the charming facade. He thought he was going to ruin me. Him, the man who had made me feel more whole in 3 days than I had in 5 years. The absurdity of it, the terrible, tragic irony, was almost too much to bear. I closed the remaining distance between us. I didn't think. I just acted. I reached out and gently took his hand. His fingers were ice cold. He flinched at my touch, but didn't pull away. I threaded my fingers through his. "You think you're scared?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Julian, I have spent the last 5 years building walls around myself so thick I couldn't even breathe. I ran away from my entire life because I was too afraid to live it. Being on that train with you was the first time in years I felt like I was actually in the room. You don't have to know what this is. I don't know what this is. All I know is that for the first time in a very long time, I don't want to be alone. And I don't want you to be either." A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stared at our joined hands as if he'd never seen them before. "What if I mess it all up?" he whispered, his voice choked with fear. "Then we'll mess it up together," I said. "Look, we have an empty room in a new city. We don't have any furniture. We don't have any rules. We don't have to name anything. We can just be. We can be 2 people in an empty room, and we can figure it out from there. One day at a time." I squeezed his hand. "Can we do that? Can we just start there?" He looked up at me then, his hazel eyes shimmering with unshed tears. He gave a small, jerky nod. The tension in his shoulders seemed to release all at once, and he sagged with a profound, exhausted relief. He brought his other hand up and covered our joined hands, holding on to me like I was a lifeline. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay." One day at a time, the crisis had passed. The storm had broken. In the quiet aftermath, standing in the middle of that empty room, holding his hand, I felt the fragile foundations of our new life begin to settle. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and it was ours. We didn't talk much more after that. The emotional honesty had drained us both. We moved with a new, quiet purpose. We ordered pizza from a place down the street, the first act of domesticity in our new, shared space. We sat on the floor, our backs against the cold wall, and ate straight from the box. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a gentle, careful tenderness. We were like two people learning a new language, speaking in small gestures and soft glances instead of words. As night fell, the logistical problem of our sleeping arrangements became unavoidable. We had no bed, no couch, just a wooden floor. We had a few blankets and pillows we'd bought at a corner store along with some other essentials. I laid them out on the floor, creating two separate, makeshift beds a few feet apart. It felt like a necessary, respectful distance, a way of acknowledging his fear and giving him space. "This is yours," I said, gesturing to one of the pallets. "I hope it's not too uncomfortable." "It's perfect," he said, his voice soft. We changed and settled in for the night. The only light came from the moon, a sliver of silver filtering through the large window, painting a luminous rectangle on the floor between us. The sound of the ocean was a constant, soothing presence, a slow, rhythmic breathing that filled the silence. I lay on my back, staring up at the slanted ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of the day's events. The hope on the train, the despair at the station, the terror and relief of our confrontation. It felt like I had lived an entire lifetime in the last 12 hours. I could hear Julian breathing in the darkness. It was a slow, even sound, but I knew he wasn't asleep. The space between our two beds felt both enormous and insignificant. It was a physical representation of the choice before us. We could remain in our separate, safe spaces, or we could close the distance. I knew the choice had to be his. I had pushed enough for one day. I had met his fear with courage. Now I had to meet his uncertainty with patience. I must have drifted off, because I was woken sometime later by a subtle shift in the room. A floorboard creaked. I opened my eyes. Julian was sitting up, a dark silhouette against the moonlit window. He was just looking at me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just watched him, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, his posture a study in indecision. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he got up. He didn't stand, but crawled, slowly, silently, across the moonlit space between us. He stopped when he reached the edge of my makeshift bed. He knelt there, a supplicant in the half-darkness. He was so close I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I could see the faint glimmer of moonlight in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his expression a mixture of question and plea. My own fear, the old, familiar instinct to bolt, whispered in the back of my mind. This was the final boundary. Crossing it would change everything, irrevocably. But as I looked at his face, at the raw vulnerability there, I knew that my fear of being alone was finally, blessedly, greater than my fear of being hurt. I shifted over, making room for him. It was the only answer I needed to give. He lay down beside me, his movements careful, almost reverent. He was on his side, facing me. The blanket was small, and we were pressed close together, our legs brushing, our shoulders touching. His face was only inches from mine. I could feel his breath on my cheek, warm and sweet. He still hadn't spoken. The silence was absolute, profound. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything we had said and everything we hadn't. He reached out a hand, not to touch my face or my body, but just to gently take my hand. His fingers were still cool, but they were steady now. He laced his fingers through mine, the same way I had done for him hours earlier. It was a gesture of reciprocation, of meeting me in the middle. "Leo," he whispered, his voice a raw, fragile thing in the quiet room. "I'm here," I whispered back. He took a shaky breath. "Would it be okay?" he started, his voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question was so breathtakingly gentle, so full of respect and uncertainty, that it undid me. He wasn't assuming. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was giving me all the power. He was making himself completely, utterly vulnerable. In that moment, he was offering me not just a kiss, but his trust, his fear, his hope. All of it. Tears pricked my eyes. Not of sadness, but of a relief so profound it felt like a physical release, like a dam breaking inside me. All the years of loneliness, of feeling unseen, of building walls, they all crumbled in the face of this one, simple, honest question. I didn't answer with words. I answered by tightening my grip on his hand and closing the small, remaining distance between us. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was tentative. It was soft. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of salt from his tears and the warmth of his breath. It was a promise. It was a beginning. It was the quiet, undeniable confirmation that the journey on the train hadn't been an escape from my old life, but a direct, unerring path to a new one. In the stillness of that empty room, with the sound of the ocean as our witness, we were finally, truly, home. We began to build a life in that empty room, slowly, piece by piece. The days that followed were a study in quiet domesticity. We bought an air mattress, a luxury that felt like a king-sized bed after nights on the floor. We found a wobbly second-hand table and 2 mismatched chairs. We bought coffee mugs and plates and silverware. Each object was a small anchor, a piece of permanence in our new, shared world. Julian's job didn't start for another week, and we spent that time in a blissful, secluded bubble. We explored the small town, walking for miles along the rocky coastline, the wind whipping our hair, the salt spray on our lips. We discovered a small bookstore, a cafe that served strong coffee, a fish and chip shop on the pier. I started taking pictures again, but something was different. My focus had shifted. I was no longer drawn to the stark, lonely images of decay and isolation. Instead, I found myself capturing moments of quiet beauty, of connection. I took a picture of Julian's hands wrapped around a warm coffee mug, the morning light catching the steam. I took a picture of his silhouette standing on the shore, looking out at the vastness of the ocean. I took a picture of his face while he was sleeping, the morning sun painting stripes across his cheek, his expression one of complete and utter peace. My camera was no longer a shield. It was a way of saying, "I see you. This is beautiful. This matters." We learned the rhythms of living with another person, the small, intimate dances of sharing a small space. I learned that he hummed when he was concentrating on something, a low, tuneless sound. I learned that he was obsessively neat with his code, but left his socks everywhere. He learned that I needed a period of quiet solitude in the morning with my coffee before I could face the world. He learned that I organized my books by color, a fact that he found both baffling and endearing. We didn't talk about the future, not really. We didn't try to define what we were. The unspoken agreement was to let it be what it was, to let it grow at its own pace, like a slow-developing photograph. Our physical intimacy was as gentle and tentative as that first kiss. It was a language we were learning together. It was holding hands while we walked down the street. It was him wrapping his arms around me from behind while I was washing dishes, resting his chin on my shoulder and watching the water. It was me tracing the lines on his palm while we sat on the floor, reading. It was sleeping curled together on the air mattress every night, a tangle of limbs, my head on his chest, his heartbeat a steady, reassuring drum beneath my ear. It was an intimacy of comfort, of safety, of profound presence. It was about healing the lonely places inside both of us. One afternoon, about a week after we arrived, I was developing some of the photos I had taken. Our bathroom was tiny, but I had managed to convert it into a makeshift darkroom. The red safe light cast a strange, otherworldly glow on everything. I was watching an image of Julian appear in the developer tray, the chemistry slowly revealing his face from the blank white paper. It felt like magic, like witnessing a memory being born. He knocked softly on the door. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Yeah, but stay by the door. Don't let any light in," I said. He slipped inside, closing the door quickly behind him. The small room was suddenly very crowded. He stood by the door, his eyes adjusting to the dim, red light. He watched me for a moment, as I gently agitated the tray with a pair of tongs. "What's it like?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Seeing it appear like that, it's like remembering something you didn't know you'd forgotten," I said, not looking up from the tray. "It's slow. You have to be patient. You can't rush it. If you pull it out too soon, it's pale and thin. If you leave it in too long, it gets dark and muddy. You have to wait for the exact right moment." I lifted the print from the developer, letting the excess chemicals drip off, and slid it into the stop bath. The image was fixed. It was a close-up of his face, taken a few days earlier when he was laughing at something I'd said. His eyes were crinkled at the corners, his whole expression open and full of joy. I moved it to the final wash and turned to look at him. In the dim red light, his face was unreadable, but his presence filled the small space. "That's what it feels like," he said softly. "Being with you," my breath caught in my throat. "It feels like I'm developing," he continued, his voice quiet and steady. "Like all these parts of me I didn't know were there are slowly coming into focus. And I just have to be patient. I have to trust the process. I have to trust you not to pull me out too soon." He had taken my clumsy metaphor and turned it into a perfect, devastatingly beautiful declaration. He had seen the core of what I was trying to say and given it back to me, refined and true. In the strange, crimson twilight of my makeshift darkroom, surrounded by the smell of chemicals and the quiet drip of water, I felt a sense of clarity so profound it was like a physical blow. The fear, the uncertainty, the ghosts of the past, they were still there, but they were no longer the subject of the photograph. They were just the shadows that gave the light its meaning. I put down my tongs and crossed the tiny room. I cupped his face in my hands, my palms cool and damp from the chemicals. He leaned into my touch, closing his eyes. "You're not a photograph, Julian," I whispered. "You're the real thing." And I kissed him, not with the tentative uncertainty of our first kiss, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally found his focus. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and fixer chemicals, a kiss that sealed the promise we had been slowly, carefully building since the moment he sat down next to me on that train. We were no longer just running from something. We were building something. Together. A home. A life. A new, beautiful picture, emerging slowly, perfectly, in its own time. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that was no longer about absence,